My name is James Cartwright, and I just couldn't imagine that my favorite hobby would turn into a real nightmare. It all started when I found an old box of games in my grandfather's attic. It was full of rare discs, and among them I noticed one that had no title, only a red label with the inscription, "Secret Project." I couldn't resist the temptation to try it. I inserted the disc into my computer and started the game. After diving into the game, I noticed that it looked very realistic, even for the time. The plot was quite simple. You had to survive in an abandoned city full of dangers. But something about this game was very strange. In the first few hours, everything looked quite normal. I wandered the streets exploring the different buildings. But then I began to notice that some of the details were too realistic. The cracks on the walls were too detailed, the elusive shadows that seemed to move behind me. Then I came across one place that seemed completely empty, but an unfamiliar melody suddenly played from the screen. I quickly hit continue, hoping it was just part of the game. But at that moment, I felt the back glass of my monitor fog up and a cold wind hit my neck. I looked around, but nothing had changed in the room. As soon as I got back into the game, the message, "You shouldn't have done this," appeared on the screen. My heart froze in my chest. I tried to exit the game, but nothing worked. The computer froze. Suddenly, there was a dull crackle from the loudspeaker, and the image on the screen began to change as if it were alive. I couldn't look away. I struggled with panic, trying to figure out what was going on. But that moment, when the game took on a life of its own, was my first step into an endless nightmare. To try to exit the game, I pressed a combination of keys, hoping that I could restart the computer or at least exit to the menu. But it did not help. The computer did not respond. The screen remained black, and the sound continued to hum. My fingers were shaking with fear when I finally decided to shut down the computer manually. As soon as I unplugged the power cord, everything went quiet. I was relieved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. After that, I decided to go back to the old computer and continue trying to figure out what happened. I looked at the drive I pulled out of the computer, and it had no signs of use. No scratches, no dust. I tossed the disk into the junk drawer, and though my heart was still racing, I tried to focus on other things. The next day, I decided to check the computer. Everything seemed fine, but as soon as I turned it on, a new message appeared on the screen. "You can't escape anymore." I tried rebooting the system again, but nothing helped. This message stayed there until I decided to see if there were other ways to fix the problem. I went to forums and groups specializing in old games, but no one knew what this game was. Everyone unanimously said that this is either some kind of expansion, or it is unlikely that you can find something similar. It didn't suit me. That evening, I decided to return to the disc and try to find more information about its origin. My curiosity got the better of my fear. I began to search the internet for records of similar games or any mention of Secret Project. I came across an old forum that mentioned similar games that had abnormal properties, games that were outdated and had unusual effects on those who played them. I gathered my strength and decided that I needed to learn more, but whatever I found, it was too strange and terrifying to believe that it could be true. Every time I tried to learn more, the fear grew stronger. I began to notice strange things. For example, when I was walking around the house, I had the feeling that someone was watching me. My dreams became disturbing. I often woke up in a cold sweat, as if someone was whispering in my ear. I felt that the game was trying to tell me something, but what exactly was unclear. Every step I took to find out more only deepened my panic. Every day, the situation became more and more unclear and scary. I felt that something invisible was playing with my consciousness. I could not sleep, my eyes were red from sleeplessness, and every sound in the dark seemed terrifying to me. One day, when I was sitting in the dark of my room, checking old records, suddenly the computer turned on by itself. I got up startled, but the screen remained black. From the moment I pressed the power button, the computer started playing again with the same eerie sounds as before. I tried pressing the keys, but nothing helped. Then a new message appeared on the screen. "The game is starting again." It was easier to feel like I was in a nightmare than to be alive. A screensaver appeared, on which I recognized places from the game that I had already tried to leave behind. That same day, I returned to the disc and noticed that a new mark appeared on it. Final. What could it mean? My curiosity was stronger than my fear. I put the disc back into the computer, not knowing what to expect next. The game loaded, and I was back in the same abandoned city, but now everything looked different. The streets were empty, without any sign of life. But the more I researched, the more I felt like I was being watched. I heard light footsteps behind me, but every time I turned around, no one was there. Suddenly, the game changed perspective. I saw my own figure in the game moving through the streets, and in every reflection, strange names appeared, all of them familiar to me. They were the names of my friends, family, even people I had only seen once in my life. I wondered why these names appeared and how the game could know so much about my surroundings. While I was trying to find answers, my friends started calling me asking why I was ignoring them. I answered them, but their voices sounded strange, as if they were tuned to some unusual wave. I felt that something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Each attempt to exit the game ended with me encountering new, horrible messages. I began to see faces of people I knew, but they were distorted and sinister. The game always said one thing: you can't get out. And so, as soon as I began to believe that it was only a game, I noticed that in real life, strange signs began to appear. I found some strange drawings on the floor near the door that I don't remember making. And every time I checked the notes or papers lying around the room, it turned out that some of them were written with unknown names. The unknown continued to torment me, and every day the fear only increased. The game that seemed to be just an escape game became a part of my life. And what's worse, every time I returned to the computer, I felt that the game entrance became more and more integrated into reality. The next day, I woke up with the feeling that I was being watched. I closed my eyes and tried to concentrate on work again, but all my thoughts were occupied by only one thing: the game. I decided to seek help from specialists. Maybe they could explain these strange effects I was experiencing. I visited several computer security specialists, but each confirmed that the drive was free of malware and that the game was perfectly fine. Every time I tried to explain what was going on, I was only asked if I was too stressed. This feeling that someone was watching me became stronger and stronger. I began to notice small details that I hadn't noticed before, subtle noises in the night that always ended when I tried to check the source of the noise, and light breaths in my back that made me turn around but find nothing. One night I decided to set up surveillance cameras to try and catch any abnormal events. I was watching the videos being recorded, and I noticed something in one of the frames that horrified me. A blurry human-like silhouette appeared on the screen and disappeared into the darkness as I got closer. I looked through all the records and noticed that the silhouette appeared in different parts of the house at different times, as if it was moving behind me. I even started asking the neighbors if they had seen anything unusual, but they all just looked at me like I was crazy. One evening, when I decided to check the computer, the game restarted by itself. I didn't press any buttons, but the screensaver from the same game appeared on the screen again, only now everything looked even more ominous. The town was empty, and I noticed that the houses began to move as if they were alive. The streets looked crooked and seemed to stretch on forever. I tried to find a way out, but every time I thought I could find a door, it turned out that it just led to another, even darker corridor. The game was so horrible that it started to feel like I was not just playing, but inside a nightmare. With every second, I felt that someone was watching me again, and this invisible watcher only added to the terror. I began to hear whispers that I couldn't make out, but they sounded like they were coming from the screen itself. I could feel the ceiling above my head starting to shake and decided to check the cameras again. However, this time I saw something more terrifying. On one of the frames, there was a scene where I was sitting in front of the computer, but my eyes were closed, and there were dark figures around me. They were slowly approaching me, like invisible hands reaching out from the darkness. That night, I could not sleep. I sat in front of the computer waiting for everything to end. I no longer knew what was reality and what was an illusion. My psyche was on the verge of breaking down, and I could no longer tell the difference between what was happening in the game and what was happening in my real life. I lived in a state of constant anxious anticipation. I couldn't understand what was happening, whether it was real or just my mind rioting with fear. After I saw these scary footage on the cameras, I did not dare to leave the computer unattended. I decided that it would be better to check everything myself. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The light in the room did not flicker. The computer did not turn on by itself. But as I walked over to the table to check the camera, I noticed that the room had gotten colder. Breathing became visible, and the sensation of someone breathing on the back of my head became almost physical. I checked all the recordings from the cameras, and in one of the videos I saw an unexpected thing. In the darkness, like a shadow, a person appeared, but it was something more like a corpse, a pale face without eyes and mouth, which slowly approached the camera. It was so horrible that I rushed to my computer trying to stop the video, but again nothing worked. All I could do was press the keys in a hopeless attempt until the video stopped by itself. From that time, I began to feel that games were no longer just a part of entertainment. They began to affect my perception of reality. I began to notice how the world around me was changing. The furniture in the room seemed blurred, and the sounds I heard became increasingly irrational. Every night I received an email. They always contained the same message: "We are watching." I tried to ignore them, but with each message my anxiety grew. I once came across one message that contained details of my habits and even my whereabouts. Then I decided to check out these places myself, trying to find at least some answers. I left the house, going to the park where I often spent time. Everything looked familiar, but when I approached the old bench, I saw "You're here again" written on it. My anxiety has reached a critical point. I decided that it was necessary to return to the game again. But now when I start the computer, the game started behaving strangely. It didn't just start, it displayed a real image of my room on the screen. I saw myself sitting in front of the monitor, but I noticed with horror that there were dark figures in the shadows of the room, slowly approaching me. I could feel the cold running through my body. The game itself began to react to my fears. As soon as I tried to switch windows or turn off the computer, the screen began to show me terrible scenes, the faces of my loved ones, but distorted, filled with fear and pain. I could feel something start to change inside of me. I could no longer distinguish where the game ended and where reality began. My dreams became increasingly disturbing. I woke up in the middle of the night to loud noises that sounded like they were from the game, but every time I checked the room, I found nothing. My psyche began to fail. I didn't know what could happen next. I was afraid to leave the house, afraid of every sound, every movement that happened in the dark. I couldn't tell the difference between reality and illusion, and it was all because of the game that started to rule my life. The feeling of fear and anxiety that gripped me reached its peak. The game was no longer just a part of my entertainment. It became a part of my life, and maybe even a part of my mind. I couldn't figure out if it was all real or if I had just lost my mind. I tried to find help from a psychotherapist, but even that did not give me relief. Every time I spoke about my experiences, the doctor looked at me with surprise, as if doubting my health. He said that I was probably stressed and that I should try to distract myself from the game. But how could I distract myself when the game had infiltrated every corner of my life? Every sound, every shadow reminded me of what I was going through. I tried to close the computer, turn off all electronic devices. But even then, the feeling that someone or something was watching me did not leave me. One evening, as I was trying to rest, I heard a faint knock on the door. I decided to check, but found nothing. Opening the door, I saw a small notebook on the floor. It was dusty and dated a few days before I found the disc. I took the notebook and opened it. On the first pages were painted instructions for the game, but with each new line, I felt more and more that this was not just a game. The writing became more and more chaotic, talking about how the game can infiltrate reality, how it uses people's fear and insecurities to become part of their world. I felt something was wrong. The pages were filled with gruesome pictures and phrases that became increasingly disturbing. I tried to understand what it all meant, but the more I read, the more I felt fear fill my heart. After that, I began to notice that reality became really illusory. The buildings on the streets seemed to me deformed. Their contours became blurred, as if the game itself was leaking into reality. I felt the walls of my room begin to shrink and the shadows begin to move. One night, I decided to try to escape from the house. I tried to escape from the game, from the fear, but as soon as I stepped outside, everything seemed as sinister as inside. The streets were empty, and in the darkness, I felt that something invisible was following me. I got home and found that the game had restarted by itself. This time, a message appeared on the screen. You can't escape. I tried to turn off the computer, but the screen remained a black bar. I heard a loud screeching noise, and suddenly the computer started making creepy noises that got louder and louder. Suddenly, I felt the room begin to spin. The feeling of being in a spiral of fear became unbearable. I tried to walk away, but I could feel my legs being dragged to the ground as if they had invisible chains. At this point, I noticed that the faces of the people who appeared in the game began to appear in the real world. Their eyes, which I saw in the dark, were just as terrifying. I tried to find my way out again, but now the room was filled with darkness that felt like a physical mass pressing down on me. I realized that the game was no longer just playing with my mind. It had become a part of my life, a part of my reality, and maybe I could no longer distinguish where one world ends and another begins. The fear I felt reached a new level. Every part of my life was intertwined with the horrors that took place in the game. I couldn't tell the difference between what was real and what was a product of my broken psyche. The impression was as if the game was penetrating my conscious and subconscious mind, endangering my health. One night, when I tried to rest, I saw new messages appear on my computer. "Congratulations, are you still here?" written on the screen. I knew it wasn't just a game. It is something more, something that controls my thoughts and fears. I tried to turn off the computer, but instead the screen suddenly started showing my own house in real time, with horrible details that weren't from the game, parts of my room that I didn't remember. Every day my fear increased. I began to see strange shadows and shapes that quickly disappeared when I tried to look at them. The furniture in the room became less and less familiar, and the sounds I heard at night seemed more and more real. One day, when I tried to find some solace in the books, I noticed that some of them were open to pages that had pictures and text that I did not remember. The texts were written in distorted calligraphy, and some of them repeated, "You run into the darkness, but you will never find a way out." At that moment, I heard a noise behind the wall, as if someone was being dragged along the corridor. My fear became so strong that I did not dare to check what was happening. I began to feel that the walls of my house were becoming alive. They seemed to breathe and tremble, as if the house itself were part of the game. I decided to conduct an experiment. I restarted my computer and tried to go into the game to see if there were any new items. As soon as I started playing, I noticed that there were new levels in the game. Dark mazes filled with creepy figures and distorted faces that resembled people from my records. I moved through this maze, and the further I went, the more I felt reality blur. And suddenly, at one point, the screen showed the room in which I was sitting. I saw myself sitting in front of the computer, and around me were the same dark figures that were in the game. This feeling of the game becoming a part of the real world became so terrifying that I fell to the floor holding my head, trying to stop this horrible nightmare. Then, when I couldn't take it anymore, I saw one of the dark figures slowly approaching me. I could feel her looking at me with her empty eyes. I tried to escape, but suddenly all the exits from the room became locked. I was trapped in my own fear with no way out. My fear became unbearable, and in the last moments, when I could bear it no more, I cried out, hoping that it would help me. But instead, I heard in response a terrible laugh that echoed from all sides. It was a laugh that seemed like part of the game, but was so real and cruel that I could feel my heart pounding in terror. My heart was beating in a frantic rhythm. My body slid across the floor like I was part of a game I couldn't control. The ghastly laughter continued to echo from all sides, as if it had penetrated my thoughts and made them its own. I knew I couldn't take it anymore. The game wasn't just a game anymore. It was a terrifying nightmare that threatened my reality. I tried to press the computer's shutdown button again, but the screen began to flicker, as if demonstrating its own sinister desire to stay on. I felt my hands refusing to obey. My fingers became icy and unable to press the necessary keys. Suddenly, the screen was filled with another terrible scene. Scenes appeared on the screen where I myself imitated movements that were repeated as in a terrible nightmare, as if the game was using my body as part of its distorted fantasies. All the actions I did were exactly reflected, but with additional elements of fear. Faces of people with terrible smiles that I did not recognize. I tried to turn off the computer, but suddenly a message appeared. The game will not end until you pass the test. I felt fear consume me. My reflection on the screen began to move independently of me. It reflected every movement, but did not obey my wishes. I was only an observer, not a participant. Suddenly, my surroundings changed. I entered a dark corridor that looked like part of the game, but much more ominous. The corridor was filled with darkness, and every time I tried to take a step forward, the walls seemed to get closer. The knocking at the door that I had heard earlier now seemed part of this terrifying maze. I tried to find an exit, but each corridor led to another, even darker passage. Only parts of the game became reality, and reality became part of the game. At the end of the corridor, I saw a small light. I rushed to him, hoping that this was a way out, but as soon as I got close, the light disappeared, leaving me in complete darkness. Then I felt something breathing on my neck. I went back, but again found nothing. I tried to banish the fear by looking at every corner of the room, but the shadows began to move again, like ominous figures that kept up with me. I could feel them getting closer and closer, and their breathing became palpable. I decided to try restarting the computer and see what happened to the game. At that moment, I saw that the game was showing me my own fears. The scenes I had seen before began to repeat themselves, but now with even more horror and distortion. It was like a virtual reflection of my worst fears. I noticed that my room had become part of the game. All the furniture, walls, and even objects around me became distorted, and scary figures appeared that repeated my actions. I no longer knew where reality ended and play began. All attempts to escape from the room were unsuccessful. The door disappeared, and the windows were filled with darkness. I felt my fear reach new heights. I tried to turn off the computer, but suddenly the screen began to show my own horrors. My loved ones who looked distorted and suffered like in my worst dreams. My fear became unbearable. I could no longer distinguish between where I was and where the game was. It became a virtual reality where I was just part of a terrifying spectacle that had no end. The room I was in turned into a real maze of horror. The shadows on the walls didn't just move, they became alive. They mixed with reality, distorting everything around me. I could feel the shadows creeping up on me as if they had a consciousness of their own, ready to consume everything I knew. I could feel my heart racing. I tried to find at least some point of support, but the walls of the room were changed. They became soft and pulsating, as if alive. I felt the whole space around me begin to breathe, as if this room were part of the very labyrinth of fear. Each step was like trying to pull myself out of the depths of the darkness. But the footsteps echoed, and I could see dark figures begin to unfold before me. These figures did not have clear shapes. They were distorted outlines that constantly changed, repeating my worst fears. I started to feel like I was having trouble breathing. There was something hostile and dense in the air, as if the breath of the room itself was poisonous. I tried restarting the computer, hoping that would help me understand what was going on, but the screen was now showing scenes I had never seen before. A room appeared on the screen that looked like my own, but with even more ominous details. I saw myself sitting on the floor, drowning in darkness, and suddenly I noticed that behind me was an unknown figure, which I could not distinguish from ordinary shadows, but its presence was unbearable. I tried to move away from the screen, but suddenly I felt someone or something grab me. I could not be freed from this terrible feeling. My hands were tightly tied and my legs could not move. My room was filled with darkness, and I could feel it begin to tighten around me. I screamed and struggled to free myself, but it was no use. My reality was falling apart, and every attempt to get out of this nightmare only deepened it. The dark figures now became a part of every detail of the room. They looked like parts of the walls, the furniture, even the air itself. Every time I tried to leave the room again, I faced a new horror. The door turned to stone and the windows were covered with black spots. I felt that these spots had become part of the darkness that now belonged to me. I sat down on the floor, trying to stay calm, but as soon as I closed my eyes, I saw the darkness filling my thoughts again. In my dreams, I saw scary figures that haunted me. Every time I woke up, I found myself in the same horrible maze. Then I noticed that strange sounds filled the darkness. They were the sounds of people in pain, their screams and moans creating an eerie chorus. I knew it wasn't just a game. It was part of my own fear come to life. I could not bear this constant terror any longer. My mind was on the verge of breaking down, and I felt there was no going back. A game that was once just a way to have fun has now become my biggest nightmare. The room I was in no longer looked like an ordinary room. It became a series of distorted corridors and rooms that appeared and disappeared without any logical order. I could feel my mind starting to give out. Fear gripped me, and I could no longer tell where reality ended and the game began. I tried to remember how I got here, but my memories faded like brushstrokes on a canvas. Mirrors appeared on the walls, but they were not ordinary mirrors. They were sophisticated ones, the cracks of which moved and emitted a weak, yellowish light. I tried to look into these mirrors, but instead of my reflection, I saw only distorted faces closing and disappearing into the darkness. I walked through one of the corridors and came across a huge mirror that reflected everything around me. This mirror was the only thing that remained unchanged. I approached it, trying to find some sign of reality, but instead, I saw my shadow moving on its own. My shadow began to move and repeat my movements, but with terrifying precision. She began to behave aggressively, and every time I took a step forward, she did the same, but with a lot of pressure. She seemed to laugh at my attempts to avoid her. I could feel the fear becoming physical, the anxiety coursing through my muscles. I tried to move away from the mirror, but my shadow began to expand, filling the entire space. I felt the mirror turn into a portal leading to an even darker and more terrifying place. Shadows from the mirror began to extend beyond it, filling the room and creating sound effects that resembled the whispers of monstrous creatures. With each new movement, the shadows became more and more aggressive. I felt that they were trying to take over my body, as if their fear and aggression were seeping into my consciousness. I tried to escape, but every time I reached a new room, I saw the same mirrors, the same horrible reflections. I found another mirror, but this time its surface was cracked, and a black liquid that looked like the liquid of the night was flowing from the cracks. I decided to look in this mirror and saw an image of myself, but not in the real world. It was me, but with a distorted face, with eyes that glowed with red fire. I realized that this reflection was part of the game of controlling my fears. Shadows from the mirrors began to appear in all corners of the room, and I felt how they began to move towards me. I tried to close my eyes, hoping that it would help me get rid of this horror. But when I opened them, everything around me became even more distorted. I saw how the shadows formed eerie figures and faces that became more and more aggressive and dangerous with each movement. I could feel these figures approaching me, feeling their terrifying presence. At the end of the corridor, I came across a huge crack tearing through the floor and walls. I felt that this crack was leading to an even darker and deeper horror. I couldn't bear this horrible nightmare anymore, but it seems that there is no way back. I decided to try restarting the computer again, but this time the screen showed only a chaotic, blurry image. There was no clear image, just flickering and distorted images that seemed to be parts of my worst fears. With each passing minute, I could feel my mind becoming less stable. The shadows and reflections in the mirrors became more aggressive, and I felt that I could not bear this horror any longer. My mind, like a stretched string, almost broke from fear and nervous tension. I tried to find a way out of this virtual trap, but every exit I tried to reach led me back to the same room filled with mirrors and darkness again and again. I could feel the game taking over my thoughts and controlling my fears. Nothing seemed real anymore, and my reality merged with the game. I came across a large monitor that suddenly began to display my face, but with horrible distortions. My reflection became distorted, with eyes glowing red and black smoke coming from my mouth. I realized that this was a symbol of my own destruction. I tried turning off the computer again, but now it seems impossible. The screen began to show chaotic footage, fragments of horrific scenes that floated in my mind. I could hear whispers coming through the speakers, promising a new level of terror if I didn't complete the game. In a fit of panic, I decided to hack the computer, hoping that it would help me escape from this horror. I hit it on the screen, but it didn't break. Instead, a black liquid flowed from the screen and began to fill the room. I could feel the liquid seeping into my skin, leaving illusions and fears in my mind. I saw a human-like figure enter the room, but with a face that looked like a mask of darkness. This figure was walking towards me, and I felt like my legs could no longer move. I realized that this was the end point, something I had feared from the beginning. The figure stopped in front of me and held out her hand as if inviting me to follow her. I knew this could only be the beginning of something even more terrifying, but I couldn't hold back any longer. I heard the figure say, "It's game over, but you'll be here forever." I was mesmerized by that voice, and as soon as I touched the figure's hand, I felt my consciousness begin to blur. My mind was sinking into darkness, and reality was slowly dissolving. The room and the figure began to disappear, and I found myself in absolute darkness that consumed my last thoughts and feelings. I could feel my body and mind becoming part of the game, part of a horrible universe from which there was no way out. I disappeared into a boundless darkness that reflected endless fear and terror. This was the last part of the story. A game that started as fun turned into a horrible nightmare that swallowed everything that was real. My mind and body became part of this endless horror where I remained forever in the dark.